Hi, everyone. Thanks for choosing to come listen to our talk here on the Carmans River and Lower Lake Fish Passage on Long Island, New York. My name is Luke Gervasi. I'm an ecologist with GEI Consultants, and I will be giving this presentation with my colleague, Laura Schwanoff. Before we get started here, I just would like to thank Heidi and Sam for all their hard work with helping to put the conference together and everyone else that was involved. I know it's not easy to do this when we're all going remote. So thank you to everyone who was involved with planning the conference. And to go ahead and get started, this talk will be about some work for fish passage in the Carmans River and Lower Lake in Yaphank, New York, that is set to break ground actually this month. So we're still in the planning and design phase of this all. And I just wanted to mention also that the main client for this job is the Suffolk County Department of Economic Development and Planning. So again, to go into where the funding really came from, the planning phase of this project was funded through the New York State Department of State and the Clean Water Air Bond Act grant. The construction phase of it was through 2 grants with DEC and the Water Quality Improvement Program and Marine Habitat and Trib Restoration program as well. And a lot of significant funding came from the Suffolk County Water Quality Protection and Restoration Program to help provide funding for this project. Just to give you an idea of how many stakeholders and players were involved with it, here's the project advisory committee that sat on the board and helped make some of the decisions and were involved in the process of the designing phase of this project. Groups that were affiliated with Suffolk County, the Central Pine Barrens Commission, the town of Brookhaven here on Long Island, some other groups, at the federal and state level, and then Trout Unlimited was involved as well. So I know not everyone knows where things are on Long Island. Kind of stinks that we finally have this meeting on Long Island and we have to do it remote, but hey, that's the way the cookie crumbles. To give you an idea of what we're looking at here when I'm talking about the site, if you look here on the slide, the left arrow is pointing at the lower lake where we're providing the fish passage to and from, and then to the right is the Carmans River. The large corridor just to the south of everything is the LIE, or Interstate 495. It is the most stressful road probably for Long Islanders besides the Belt Parkway. For those of you that know it, you know what I'm talking about. And just to give a better idea of where this project actually took place, here's an aerial image of where Lower Lake is and the Carmans River. So you can see that it flows out into the Great South Bay down to the south there in the southwest portion of the image. Up into the northeast is the Peconic River estuary in Riverhead, and Peconic Bay that feeds out right there. And then obviously we have the Long Island Sound to the north and the Atlantic Ocean to the south. So this area is pretty, decently far east on the island and pretty centrally located within Long Island right there. So to take a look, here are some of the existing conditions at the site, and I promise, don't worry, I will get into fish soon. To the left, you see the picture of the existing flashboard and concrete culvert spillway that exists on Lower Lake. So you can see that flashboard that exists there, and then the viewing platform on the righter edge of that photo. In the top right, it's actually a pretty neat photo looking under the spillway and under the culvert to the spillway, of where that flashboard is in the left photo. There is a 12-foot difference from the Lower Lake to the Carmans River. So nothing is really going up or downstream in this river and lake system right now, and is the reason why we undertook this project to provide some natural fish passageway. The bottom photo just shows that spillway arch a little bit further out to give you an idea of what kind of culvert we're talking about. And if you look what's going over it, that is Yaphank Road, which provides a pretty significant corridor, which we'll speak about in a little bit as well. So when doing this project, we really had target species that we were looking at, some of which you all may have guessed already. But really our target species when designing and undertaking this project, we were looking at alewife, my favorite, the American eel, and brook trout. The fishway design, when you're doing work like this, you got to consider the water depth, channel slope, flow velocity preferences, and sprinting ability of all the target fishes. So, there are things we know about brook trout that aren't necessarily true for American eel or the alewives themselves. Luckily, though, brook trout, most, if not all, salmonids are very strong swimmers and can tolerate turbulence very well and can kind of deal with a lot of conditions that natural or artificial fish passageways present. Whereas eels and alewives, there are a little bit of a difference. They prefer rock ramps at about a 3 to 5% slope, but alewives primarily migrate during the day, while eels are, they're really nocturnal and kind of moving at night. And the upstream migrating juveniles tend to use very shallow water. So we did a big literature review and study of all these species to kind of come up with the design phase of this project. And while we were going through it, there was a lot of data on American eel and brook trout in this area of the state, but there wasn't all that much on alewife. So in its place, we used a very similar species in the American shad to inform our decisions with alewife fish passageway. Again, just whenever you're doing some sort of restoration job or particularly a fish passage design, it's absolutely critical to keep in mind what things the target species are looking for. So, we need to keep in mind those objectives when doing restoration work. Like I mentioned, the brook trout are amazing swimmers and jumpers that could really tolerate turbulence, and they can easily navigate anything that is a herring-friendly design. Whereas the alewives and eel could be a little bit more tricky. The alewives move upstream in spring, while the juveniles are moving downstream in fall. And the eels are opposite, where juveniles are moving upstream in spring after they come back from the Sargasso Sea, and adults are moving downstream in fall. They both, can use rock ramps at that 3 to 5% slope. They do take up a lot more space, but are really the only fishways that can accommodate these species in an upstream and downstream direction. So again, if we were only looking at certain species, we might use a different type of fish passageway or different slopes or things like that. But we had, those 3 species that we were looking at of brook trout, alewife, and eel. And again, just another bullet point here about, what we found in some of the research that, they're not overly selective about stream size, and they'll use tributaries as spawning and rearing habitat. And it gave us more options with respect to attraction flow than we would have if either of the species was only associated with, medium or large rivers. So just to give this for your reference, it's a table kind of comparing the needs of alewives and American eel. And again, brook trout aren't on this because we know they're hardy. They could deal with, either of the conditions that we would set up for alewife or American eel. You can see they have that same maximum slope there at 3 to 5%. Alewife prefer a certain slot width. Depth in fishway is also very variable between species, but luckily, for eels, it can be very shallow. Alewives, need a little bit more water than that. Maximum flow rates, it's really only for alewife. The eel, it's not as much of a factor when you're considering things like that. And then obviously when needed, there's a different time frame seasonally and even daily with a 24-hour clock of when these species might be using the fish passageway. So I'm going to hand it off to Laura now. Thanks everyone for taking the time to listen to the talk, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this.
Thank you, Luke, for that great overview of fish requirements and swimming requirements. Just want to review some of the design considerations that went into planning this fishway passage. This slide shows several different alternative locations that we considered to develop that fishway. The upper line shown in green here shows a means of connecting Lower Lake directly to Carmans River and bypassing the existing spillway. The blue line, the middle blue line, shows the spillway that the fish passage would go through the existing spillway, but would have to take a sharp right-hand turn in order to achieve the slopes that are needed to pass the fish. The orange line here shows that the fishway would pass through the existing spillway with some modifications, and the pink line leading to the south would bypass the existing spillway, enter the lower end of Lower Lake, and then connect down to Carmans River. That was actually the preferred design until we ran into some design constraints that we're going to cover. We also considered a number of different fishway types. On the upper left is a vertical slot fishway. it was determined it would not be as conducive to pass all the target species we were planning for. The lower left depicts a Daniil fishway, more of those off-the-shelf type fishways. The issue with this type of fishway is the fish would have to do a 180-degree turn or 290-degree turns to be able to pass from the upper lake to the Carmans River and reverse. It's not as conducive to passing the fish. The lower right sketch depicts a rock ramp fishway. It incorporates natural materials, but there's still a 180-degree bend that the fish would have to navigate to be able to use that fishway. The upper right shows a pool and weir system, which is exactly what was chosen in the end by our design, except that we added natural rock weirs rather than prefabricated metal or other types of weirs in the passageway. Some of the issues we encountered along the way in planning and design, as I mentioned earlier, there's that one fishway location that went from Carmans River directly to the southern end of Lower Lake. That was our preferred alternative. It would have been a totally natural fishway, but unfortunately we discovered during the planning and design process that there's a high pressure gas main under Yaphank Road that could not be modified, so that discarded that alternative location. We're also working within the Yaphank Historical District that has its own constraints associated with this project. The project actually occupies an area where there was an old mill dam, and those kind of cultural artifacts and resources had to be preserved. The project took a number of years. As we mentioned, it's about 10 years in making, from planning through design development and ultimately to construction. The funding sources were filtering in over time to support this project, and the project had extensive amount of permitting that it had to go through in order to get the final approvals. This next slide gives you an idea of the number of permits and approvals that were necessary for this project. Just want to point out, once all the planning and design was worked out, the final design had to go in front of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fisheries specialists to confirm that the project would actually function as designed, would provide the correct attraction flow, correct slope, before anyone in New York State could approve of this project. So it was a long process, but turned out to be very fruitful. As mentioned earlier, the project is located within the Yaphank Historic District, and as such, there's a number of historic buildings and structures that are on the state and federal list that needed to be avoided and protected for this project. The existing spillway actually outlets into Carmans River underneath some old mill dams, and there currently are pilings and walls that are reminiscent of those old buildings that need to remain in place once this project goes into construction. The Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation required some analysis by a local expert. We had Paleo West Archaeology do the on-site review, some soil and artifact identification, and they were part of the process in the design to come up with a methodology that would protect and preserve these artifacts in place. If during construction any of those artifacts are discovered, they can actually, some of them will be retained and buried in place. Others that are on the surface will be removed and brought to a museum. This figure depicts the final design that was approved by all of the agencies, and thanks very much to all the project advisory committee individuals that, that supported this design. I would be remiss if I didn't mention all of the GEI engineers, the hydrologic and geotechnical engineers, and the fish specialists who helped to design this passageway. And I want to just walk you through the different components of this passage. You can see that this is a pool and weir system. That was what was finally selected. The fish passage will run through the existing spillway. You can see here that there are weir boulders that'll provide a location for where the fish can jump and then rest and then jump in a series to get up to the lower lake elevation. A cofferdam is proposed on the lower lake side to allow that passageway to extend into lower lake. One of our critical elements was trying to span the 12-foot elevation difference between lower lake and Carmans River. With the spillway the way it's laid out right now, we're able to achieve that 2 to 5% slope in the bottom of the fishway. If we did not have that extension into lower lake, it would be way too steep for those fish to negotiate moving upstream to get back into lower lake. The next slide shows some of the concerns that we also had to deal with the project. There had been a previous release of sediment downstream into Carmans River when some other invasive species controls were taking place. So the project incorporated quite a few methods of protecting Carmans River downstream from movement of any disturbed sediments. Silt fences will be installed prior to any ground disturbance. Marsh mats will be incorporated to access the lake and Carmans River during construction. Turbidity curtains will be installed on both ends. The sheet pile cofferdam will allow for the upstream area to be dewatered and the sediment there to be removed prior to doing the construction. And any accumulated silt and debris that does wind up moving down will be caught within the downstream silt curtain and removed. The entire area that's disturbed will also be revegetated before the project is finalized. This current figure gives you an idea of what the Carmans River Fish Passage will look like. On the upper left is Lower Lake, and on the lower right, that would be the discharge into Carmans River. You might note that there is a blue pipe extending out below the downstream side. That's a low-level outlet that had to be incorporated into the design to allow passage of the 100-year flood. That was a requirement of the New York State Dam Safety Unit. Also, as Luke mentioned earlier, this fish passage is going to be passing under Yaphank Avenue that connects the downtown historic district to the county offices to the south, just south of the Long Island Expressway. You might be interested to know that there is an aquatic bench on the upstream side, which will provide a gradual slope out to the end of the cofferdam. That aquatic bench will be planted with emergent wetland plants, and it will also function to direct fish to find the entrance on the upstream side through the cofferdam. On the downstream side, there will be some wetland restoration taking place to bring the Carmans River species along the bank back to their existing condition. We want to thank you for listening in to our presentation. What we would like to do is sum this up and let you know that this 10 years of planning and design, I think, is all well worth it. We know that the agencies are very excited to see this vision turned into reality. The project is scheduled to start construction in March. We're hoping that, that schedule can still be accommodated depending on the weather. And we'd like to put a big thanks back out again to the Suffolk County Department of Economic Development and Planning, who spearheaded this entire process, as well as all the other agencies and project advisory committee that was involved in the planning and design. Thank you very much, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Our contact information is shown on this slide. Thank you again.